Good morning. Welcome back to our fourth Anchored in the Word morning reflection this week. And it's Thursday. The week's almost over. And so I hope that as we've been working through this text that you've been given some things to think about and that it's been an encouragement to you. Well, this morning what we're going to do is actually dig into the content of the text when Jesus gives the parable of the Good Samaritan. So rather than reading the beginning part, as we've been reading each morning, we're going to get into the parable itself. And so we're going to pick up Luke chapter 10. We're looking at verses 25 to 37, but we're going to start in verse 29 this morning. Here's what it says. But he, willing to justify himself, said unto God, And who is my neighbor? And Jesus answering said, A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and fell amongst thieves, which stripped him of his raiment, and wounded him, and departed, leaving him half dead. And by chance there came down a certain priest that way, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise a Levite, when he was at that place, came and looked on him, and passed by on the other side. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was. And when he saw him, he had compassion on him, and went to him and bound up his wounds, putting oil and wine, and set him on his own beast, and brought him to the inn, and took care of him. And on the morrow, when he departed, he took out 2 pence, and gave them to the host, and said unto him, Take care of him, and whatsoever thou spendest more when I come again, I'll repay thee. Which now of these 3 thinkest thou was neighbor unto him that fell amongst the thieves? And he said, He that showed mercy on him. Then said Jesus unto him, Go and do likewise. Now we've talked about the problems that this man encountered in his own heart as he comes to Jesus. We've seen how Jesus dealt with him, where he asked a series of questions. What does the law say? How do you read what it says? And then we see the counter question that the man asks. He says, Well, who's my neighbor? Now I'd like you to notice how Jesus responds to this. The first thing is that there are 4 characters that are mentioned in these verses. The first character is a man who's taking a journey, and he's traveling, it says, down from Jerusalem to Jericho. And the reason he says down is because it's nearly a 3,000-foot drop from Jerusalem down to Jericho. And the road is very treacherous. It's very steep. It's very rugged. It's a very remote road. And that road is almost 18 miles long. And so when people traveled down that road, especially if they were traveling alone, they were very vulnerable to thieves, which would have been a common problem in those days. And so that as Jesus is telling this story, he says that the man goes down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and there he's met by a band of thieves. And these thieves were brutal with the man. They beat him nearly to death. They stripped off his clothes and left him lying on the ground, and they took everything that he had. And as this man is there laying on the side of the road, he's dying, he's helpless, there's nobody to help him, and he is basically going to die there in his misery. And then the way that Jesus tells the story is it says, it just so happened that there was a priest who was coming down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he spots the man there lying on the ground in his own blood, dying on the roadside. Now, when he says it's a priest, and the lawyer is listening to this story, in his mind he goes, wow, what an act of God's kindness that this priest encounters this man. Perhaps the priest can help him. But when the priest sees him, that's not what he does. The scripture says that he passed by on the other side of the road and he hurries on his way. Now, you might ask, well, what was a priest doing in Jerusalem? A priest was in Jerusalem functioning as a priest would in the temple itself. So here's a man who would have been actually involved in sacrifices and working in the temple because that's what priests do. And so this is a stunning act of cowardice. It's a stunning act of coldness. It's a stunning act of hypocrisy. Here's a man who had been serving as the go-between between the average person and God himself, involved in the sacrificial system. And here's a man dying on the roadside, and he just ignores him. And so the lawyer sitting there going, that's not good. Jesus says, but there's a second man that came by. And the second man was a Levite. Now, if someone was going to be in the priesthood, they had to be a Levite. But a Levite was someone who, though they were not a priest, would have been involved in duties in the temple itself. And so this man leaving Jerusalem and going down to Jericho on this road would have been involved in some of the very same things that the priest would have been involved in. He would have been serving alongside of the priest. He would have been involved in religious duties. And so certainly a man who's just been involved in serving God and serving the people would have a conscience that would be pricked if he saw a man lying on the roadside, left for dead, and likely going to die. But that's not what happened. When he sees the man, he responds the exact same way as the priest. Now, as Jesus is telling the story, you've got to think that the lawyer in the back of his mind is going, why is he saying this? Well, the reason that he's saying this is because the man is just like the priest, and the man is just like the Levite. And Jesus says, but there was a third man who came through that way as well. But this man was a Samaritan. Now, a Samaritan was someone who, if he had been in Jerusalem and was worshiping in the temple, would have been an unusual Samaritan, because the Samaritans did not worship in the temple in Jerusalem. The Samaritans worshiped in another part of Israel, and in fact, it was a great tension between the Jews in Judah and below, and the Assyria, or the Jews who lived north, who would have been a part of Samaria. And so this man was probably not in the temple because the Samaritans did not worship in the temple. And even if the man desired to be worshiping in the temple, because he was a Samaritan and he had Gentile ancestry, he would not have been permitted to be worshiping in the temple, in the court where the Jewish men would have gone. He would have been excluded from that location because of his ancestry. And so this man would have been in the court of the Gentiles if that's what he was doing. And so when Jesus mentions a Samaritan, immediately this lawyer would have gone, oh, one of those people. Oh yeah, those people that they do not worship in Jerusalem like we do. Those people who are compromised because they intermarried with the Assyrians, our conquerors. Those people who are clearly worshiping a different God than us. There were a lot of tensions between the Jews and the Samaritans, a religious tension, a nationalistic tension, a racial tension. All of those pieces would have been there. But when Jesus brings up the Samaritan, the way that the Samaritan responds is entirely different than the way that the priest and the Levite responded. Because what it tells us is that when this man saw him, it says he had compassion on him. It didn't say that about the priest. It didn't say that about the Levite. It says they went to the other side of the road and they passed by quickly. This man, he sees him and he has compassion. His heart is moved. And we would have to assume that his heart was moved towards someone who was not another Samaritan, who was a Jew just like the priest and the Levite. And so here's this man who for over 500 years there has been tension between the Jews and the Samaritans. And now this man has compassion on someone who would have had really no respect for him. And that someone who would have not loved him and been kind to him. I don't even know if we could use the word enemy, because it might have even fit in such a situation. But then it goes beyond that. Not only is his heart moved, but it says that he went down to this man and he bound up his wounds, and he took the wine and he took the ointment, and he took care of the man's wounds, and he lifts him up and he puts him on his own beast, and he walks him down to a place where he can rest. Now, we have no idea where in the road he met this man, but for many, many miles, we're talking about potentially several hours of travel, this man is walking and he's leading this animal who's carrying this wounded man who's nearly dead. And then he takes the man to an inn. And when he takes him to the inn, he lays him down and he basically says this: I want you to take care of this man, and I'm going to leave you 2 pence. And those 2 pence would have been the equivalent of 2 days of work. So, if a person works hourly in the United States, $20 an hour, we're talking about maybe $400 or $500 worth of money right here. So we're not talking about a small amount of money. This is a significant amount of money. He says, take care of him. Take this money. I'm going to pass back through here. And if I owe you anything, I'll pay you back. But take care of this man in my absence. Now, what do we see? We see a priest who didn't want to deal with this issue. We see a Levite who didn't want to deal with this issue. And we see a Samaritan who was moved with compassion, took his own financial resources, took his time, took his energies. He was willing to get dirty to help this man. And you say, well, Joel, what's the point? The point is that Jesus wants this man to understand that he does not love his neighbor. And there's a particular kind of neighbor that he does not have love for. And this man is just like the priest. And he's just like the Levite. And he needs to see for himself in the story that this is the kind of man he is. And this is the way that Jesus sees him. And this is the way that God sees him. As a man who has more desire to preserve his own life and preserve his own money and preserve his own energies than to get down on his hands and his knees and get dirty and help a person who's about to die in a ditch. And so I ask this question. Do we really understand what God's love is for people? Do we understand the depths of it? Do we understand how beautiful and powerful it is, yet how it is so much unlike the way that we tend to think towards others? Before we get all agitated with this man, the truth is he doesn't know if there are thieves that are laying in wait for him as he goes to help this man. And then they come out and they attack him, and he ends up in the exact same place as this man did. The fact is he didn't care. In the story, his life was not as important to him as the life of this man. His money was not as important to him as the life of this man. His time and his energy was not as important to him as this man's. And as Jesus is going to say at the end, go and do likewise. We need to be like the Samaritan. But I'm going to tell you that that is not the only piece to the point of Jesus's telling the story. And so, Lord willing, tomorrow we will examine why Jesus told the story and what he was trying to tell this man. So, Lord willing, tomorrow we'll cap off the week with an explanation of the parable and then some thoughts of application. Hope that you have a blessed rest of your Thursday, and Lord willing, tomorrow we'll meet again. Bye now.